I won't tell you what I know about the nuclear industry because no one will feel safe. In this presentation, I'm going to be bouncing between a lot of analogies. If I stop making sense, that's why. It is deliberate, I promise you. And let's start with the obvious. Who am I? I'm James Moore. I run a second-generation family security and tech consultancy. Yes, I know that's a mouthful. I'm also a chartered security professional. That means I get a shiny badge. Usually I wear it, but I couldn't find it this morning. As I said, I run Boars. It's a specialist family tech and security consultancy. And I do an awful lot of talking, so I apologise in advance. Now, a little bit of family history. For anyone who recognises this, I grew up knowing this as Grandad's plane. This will be relevant later on, I promise. So remember that, this is Grandad's plane. When we talk about doing security assessments, if you're looking at ISO or many other compliance standards, there's this idea of the crown jewels, the most valuable asset. And ultimately, for anything in security, what we're concerned about is the compromise of an asset. It doesn't matter if it's information, if it's physical, if it's a person, if it's an abstract. That is what we are seeking to protect as our security duty. Now, ISO talks about the crown jewels. It's a nice idea. It's the most valuable thing you have, the thing you want to protect and keep safe. I'm not a huge fan of the term crown jewels because that's something that you put on display somewhere and build walls around it and put a lot of security around it. And it's not useful in that situation, which is a problem because utility is a security property. If it's not useful, it's not secure. So I much prefer, and we are a family business, to talk about family jewels. They're useful. Unlike crown jewels, it doesn't just cost you if they get stolen or if they get damaged. It really hurts. It's also not just theft you're worried about. I mean, obviously you are worried about theft of family jewels, but you're also worried about damage. You're worried about unauthorised tampering. You might be worried about cloning, all sorts of other things. Whereas if we talk crown jewels, it very much focuses on this idea of theft, which isn't the only threat we're worried about. So ultimately, ISO, really nice structure, really nice ISMS guideline. Still don't like the crown jewel concept. We do need to widen it, and we need to think wider. Now, ultimately, in security, we are about risk management. That's what we deliver. It's not what we sell peace of mind, but what we deliver is risk management. And there's a lot of different models of risk management. There's one which is right. Other people may disagree, it's fine, they're wrong. We care about risk management, not risk reduction. That's the first thing. It's not always about reducing the risk. You can reduce the risk to zero by flying off to the Bahamas and quitting your job. Zero risk, it's great. Don't make much money, but zero risk. So, when we're talking about risk, a risk is the product of three different things. Like pizza. It's the product of a threat. A threat is an external factor which seeks to cause you harm, not necessarily deliberately, and is out of your control. Now, when I say external here, I'm not excluding your employees. And I'm not saying all threats are malicious. Sometimes threats can be seeking to be helpful by saying, oh, well, I'll just authorise that payment. I'll just buy that gift card for the CEO because he's asked me to as a nice surprise for the whole office. I'll just let that supplier through without doing the due diligence on them properly because they're nice people, we've been working with them for years. They'd never be a problem. I'll just pay that invoice. Came through, it's got the right logos, yeah, it's different bank details, but they change banks sometimes. That's threat. External, something which is seeking to cause you harm, compromise one of your assets. Next, we have the DOE, the vulnerability. This is the weakness in your system. Ultimately, a threat acts on a vulnerability to cause something, to cause you harm. Now, a vulnerability is entirely in your control. It's a weakness in your systems. And where this gets interesting is for different organisations, threats will vary. And I'm not just talking about because they're different sectors. If you've got greater influence, your threats will be further away from you. If you're a government, then crime isn't a threat, that's a vulnerability. There are other threats that cause it. If you're a company, criminals are a threat. They are outside of your control. You cannot stop crime existing. You do not have that sort of influence. There is nothing you can do about it apart from try to deter them. But you can lock your doors, you can bar your windows, you can put security guards around your runway. So vulnerabilities are within your control, they're within your gift. You will hear people talk about, with risk, likelihood. The problem with likelihood is it's actually just threat and vulnerability. It really is. If you don't have the threat, if you don't have the vulnerability, the likelihood is zero. If you've got a very high profile threat and you've got a massive gaping hole in your defences, the likelihood is really high. And then finally, we have impact. And impact is always going to be some sort of compromise of an asset. Always. It's either going to be an asset being stolen or damaged or tampered with or altered. But in some way, the impact is going to be an asset being compromised. If we lose sight of this, if we lose sight of what risks actually are, it becomes very much an academic exercise. And we get nice charts with all sorts of colours on and numbers written next to them saying, well, this will cost £500,000 or $500,000 for the Americans in the room, or pick your currency, which doesn't actually carry the impact. Now, you're in aviation. This is a safety critical industry. I used to work for a mobile company, one of the larger ones. They had a measure for outages, which I think is really important and shows something. Their measure was, for every 24 hours outage of the mobile network, they believed there would be 2 excess deaths in the country. That was their measure. It wasn't, there will be a loss of revenue. It was, if we fail, people will die, because that was what was most important. If you start reducing it to numbers, you get problems. That's their impact. Now, all of this, you get a nice tasty pizza. This is why we talk about risk appetite, by the way, because risk management is cookery. But you get a nice tasty pizza, risk appetite, how much can I eat? How much can I accept? How much do I want? Because as I said, it's not always about risk reduction. Sometimes it's about risk optimization. There we go. Haven't had enough coffee today. Sometimes you want to increase risk, because risk comes from change and uncertainty. It's not the flip side of opportunity, it's the same thing. It's just that opportunity, the impact is a positive that you're seeking. You can also, for different parts of the business, order things other than pizza. So that's really good news. You don't have to have a single organisation-wide risk appetite or risk tolerance. You look at the different areas and you consider what's appropriate here. Risk tolerance, incidentally, is if you've got a lactose intolerance, you want a lot less pizza. So you can eat a lot less. It's the maximum you can possibly have, not the maximum you want. And then finally, vulnerabilities, the weak points, the targets that people are going for. So this is what the threats are after. It's what they are seeking to find a way to compromise the assets, usually for profit, sometimes because they just want to get the job done. It's a Friday afternoon. If they just click it and approve that thing, they get to go home early, otherwise they'll have to stick around late. They just need to click on that link in that email because their whole job is clicking links in emails and no one told them that one's bad, and your email system isn't properly configured to protect them as it should be, as every email system should be. But if you know your assets inside and out, you know the vulnerabilities, you know the weak points, you know the impacts because you know what happens if that asset is compromised in some way, suddenly you've got a very clear picture of the whole thing. Don't worry, I will get onto the weakest link. but I figured we heard a lot about it yesterday. We don't necessarily need to hear more and more iterations of it straight away. So, security assessment. First of all, going very Sun Tzu, art of war and security. First, know yourself. Asset inventory, asset register, asset identification, asset analysis. You cannot do anything at all, until you know what you have. And I'm not saying you have to go down to every single printer, although you should. I have been in environments where printers were used for about 5 years to scan passports, insurance documents, birth certificates and everything else, and they stored it all in a cache on an open network which no one bothered cleaning. That was fun. So do go down to every printer, but I'm not saying you have to, not to get it started. You do need to know your assets. You need to know what's important to you and what you think is unimportant, and be very sure it actually is unimportant. Now, secondly, we heard about this yesterday, know your threats, internal and external. The ones who are actively seeking to harm you and the ones who will harm you accidentally, who aren't aggressive, who don't dislike you, but some of your controls just get in the way and they want to get the job done. Sometimes it's just that, well, they really want to go on that holiday, they really want to do that thing, and your procedures are getting in the way. So they will work around them if you've given them any way to do so. Good news about humans, we are very good at workarounds. And third, know your weak points. You know your threats, you know your assets. What can they use to work around things? What can they use to cause an impact, to compromise something that you own? Weakest link is coming up, don't worry. Bit of history. For anyone younger than me, the idea of the weakest link does not actually come from a quiz show and Anne Robinson. It comes from the Navy. And the idea is that the weakest link is the last link in the anchor chain before the anchor itself. Now this is important. Who here believes that weakest links should always be reinforced and strengthened? Good answer. I asked that on LinkedIn. 60% said yes. If you strengthen that weakest link in the anchor chain, you get a capsized ship. It's a bad idea. So it came from the idea, and yes, the etymology is hard to trace. This may be part myth. It came from the idea that if you are dropping anchor or weighing anchor, and it snags on something, or you are in rough weather, or there's a swell or a strong wind, and that anchor's holding you down, you can end up underwater. Ships aren't meant to go underwater. I know you all work in aviation, I'm not sure how familiar you are with seagoing vessels. They aren't meant to go underwater. So the weakest link is designed to break before it pulls the ship under. It can also be, if you're weighing anchor and the seabed is lower than you think, that suddenly that weight of that anchor, they're really heavy along with the chain, just capsizes the ship. So again, it breaks at the point it would do that, and you lose the anchor. But that's just a large hunk of metal you can replace. The ship with people on it is a lot more expensive. It's really important to recognise that. It is designed to break when it becomes unsafe. The weakest link is not a bad thing. It is engineered in deliberately. And when we talk about humans being the weakest link in security, this suddenly gives it a really unpleasant slant. Because we're suddenly saying, yeah, we're engineering the humans to fail because we can afford for them to fail. That means we can blame them. That means we can say they're the scapegoat. Let's ignore all of the poor engineering around protocols and safety and security in our systems that should have protected them. Just a personal rant there. Don't worry, the whole thing's not about that. But humans are not the weakest link. It's the main point. Another weakest link, circuit breakers. Pretty much all modern electrical systems have these. Engineered in weakest links. So that if you've placed too much load on the system, it breaks. and stops your house from burning down, or stops your in-flight entertainment system from blowing out. Designed-in weakest links are really, really important when you have planned for them. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, often the weakest link is focused on as, let's fix it. And we really need to think carefully about that. Used to be that DDoS attacks, a common defense against them was, we'll just take the website offline. Well, now people don't want to take the website offline because we've got uptime targets to hit and there's revenue lost. Which is why we now have EDOS attacks. Economic denial of service, where they're not trying to knock your service offline, they're trying to run your Amazon bill up so high that they damage your bottom line. They've recognised that the economics are more important, and so they've changed their angle of attack. That's mainly used by hacktivists, by people who are trying to attack for a cause. One of the favourite targets of hacktivist groups is, I'm sorry to say, the aviation industry. Maybe it's worth just taking the website offline instead of funding Amazon for more millions. They've got enough money. Now, I'm sorry to everyone who knows what this plane is and knows about PowerPoint animations. I couldn't resist. I can tell who knows what it is. There we go. Back to Grandad's plane. Now, I want to put a disclaimer in here. It is entirely possible this is Bohr's family legend. But the story goes that when he was engineering the Harrier with a team, not just him on his own, although if he told you it was him on his own, when he was engineering it, it was built with a deliberate flaw in the wing design. This deliberate flaw in the wing design meant that when it stalled, it would tend to spin in one direction, not in the other. Now, a stall's still a bad thing, but you can correct it. If you know which way the plane is going to stall in advance, that saves you precious milliseconds of time in taking corrective action. This is where the weakest link starts coming into cybersecurity. If you've identified your weakest link, it's not purely about saying, oh, let's use it to cut away that remote office that's been infected and save the rest of the ship. It's also, we know that there's likely to be problems here. That means this asset will be compromised. That means we can put plans in place. Even if we can't fix the link, we can put plans in place to correct it with as little time spent thinking as possible. Predictable failure is just as important as having options for all sorts of response. The last thing you want in an instant meeting is 10 minutes of,